It was fall semester, 1982, at the University of South Carolina. It was also Halloween night, and they were showing a film in the Russell House Student Union that I had never seen before, but had heard lots about. Free admission, no particular expectations, but just a fun way to spend Halloween. I want to tell you about that night and how I found out I wasn't the person I had been told that I was. Not the whole story, at least. Not yet, but the beginning of it. I was only 18, freshly arrived from a town called Allendale, and I was, to put it plainly, a mess. Not visibly. Visibly I was fine. Doing my coursework, making friends, eating dining hall food of a quality that should have been reported to someone. But inside there was something that I was carrying that I really didn't have words for yet, and it was getting heavier by the week. The university again was called, and I want to be very clear that I am not making this up, the University of South Carolina, home of the Fighting Gamecocks. You know, the Roosters. Their annual homecoming celebration is called Cockfest, and I'll be returning to that and its significance a little bit later. Now, the universe has a sense of humor. It's not always a subtle one. So it was Halloween night, and a bunch of students had piled into the Russell House. The lights went down, and I sat in the dark with a bag of popcorn. The film was Night of the Living Dead. Now, I should tell you what I knew about zombies in 1982, coming from where I came from. My entire zombie education consisted of two films. White Zombie, 1932, starring Bela Lugosi, who loomed and glowered upon the screen, running the undead like a supernatural middle manager. The other film was I Walked with a Zombie in 1943. A genuinely beautiful Val Lewton production, eerie as hell, and also featuring zombies as passive, controlled, shambling things. Voodoo servants, empty vessels. The zombie was a slave. That was everything I understood the word to mean. And then Romero's zombies came out of the dark. These things weren't controlled by anyone. They weren't serving anyone's agenda. They were just the dead. Back and wanting one thing, never going to stop wanting it, and never going to get tired, and never going to negotiate. You couldn't reason with them, couldn't wait them out. You could run, you could board up the windows, you could find other survivors and argue about strategy until you were blue in the face and hold it together through the night. And yet they were still coming. They're coming to get you, Barbara. I was gripping the armrest. Genuinely frightened. The kind you can't quite talk yourself out of, even knowing it's a film. It gets under their skin and stays there. Does all of this on a budget that wouldn't cover a decent used car, in black and white, with a cast that nobody had heard of. And then Ben walked in. A black man. Calm, decisive, competent. The most capable person in the building. And he knew it, and he didn't apologize for it. And the film didn't ask him to. I sat up straighter in my seat. You see, I grew up in a small town called Allendale, South Carolina, where I attended Allendale Academy from the 1st grade through the 12th grade. 12 years in the same building with the same 25 people. Our school mascot was a Confederate soldier. We were the rebels, and we flew a Confederate battle flag as our school flag. Our school song was Dixie, and I'd never, not once, in 18 years of living in a town that was majority black, sat down next to a black student in a classroom. That school existed specifically so I would not have to. I'd been told in 100 ways that didn't need words that the world had a shape. People who led and people who followed. There was a natural order to things, not something that you would question. And on a screen in Columbia, South Carolina, in the fall of 1982, a black man was boarding up a farmhouse, taking charge, keeping people alive, and absolutely refusing to be anything other than the hero of the story. The dead were at the windows, and Ben was in the room. Something shifted in me that night. Quiet, small, permanent. I didn't have language for it. Again, I was only 18. and had never left home before. I was carrying something that I didn't have a word for, and I was sitting in the dark in Columbia, South Carolina, far from Allendale, and a film made for nothing by people nobody had ever heard of was rearranging something inside me. It would take me a little while longer to understand what. This is episode 5 of Baz to the Bone, Night of the Living Dead and the Hero Nobody Expected. It's about a film. It's about a man named Duane Jones. It's about a town called Allendale. And it's about what happens when the world tells you what shape it has, and then something comes along and changes the shape entirely. Let's go. So let me tell you what this episode is and what it isn't. It isn't a lecture. I'm not a historian, not a sociologist, not the person you come to for a rigorous academic deconstruction of race in American cinema. There are people who do that beautifully. That's not what this is. And it isn't an apology tour either. I'm not going to spend the next hour flagellating myself for the town I grew up in, or the school I attended, or the flag that flew over it. I was a child. Children don't choose their architecture. What they do with it later, that's the part that matters. What this is a story. Several stories, actually, braided together. A story about a film made in 1968 in Pittsburgh by a group of people with almost no money and no idea what they were about to do to cinema. A story about a man named Duane Jones who walked into that film by accident, delivered one of the most important performances in American screen history, and then mostly went back to his actual life as an academic and theater director, because that was who he really was. It's about a town in South Carolina built around a particular story about who mattered and who didn't. And a kid from that town who sat in a dark room in 1982 and watched something that quietly, permanently rearranged the furniture. These stories do connect, I promise you that. Just give me some time and I'll show you how. I said in the cold open that this is the most honest episode I've made, and I mean it. The previous episodes, I love them, they're mine. I stand by every word. But they had some armor on them. The wit was real, but it was also, if I'm being honest, a bit protective. The chandelier story, the velvet top hat, the werewolves, all true, all me, and all to some degree a way of talking about hard things while keeping one hand on the emergency exit. This episode does not have an emergency exit. I want to say one thing clearly before we go any further. I'm a white man talking about a film whose power is inseparable from race. I grew up in a segregated bubble. I had, and I'll explain this properly later, the particular luxury of being in a minority that could pass. Could choose in most circumstances whether to be visible or invisible. Duane Jones didn't have that. Ben doesn't have that. The men who shoot him at dawn didn't stop to ask questions. They saw what they saw and acted on it. I'm not going to pretend my experience and Ben's are the same. They're absolutely not. But watching that film at a specific moment in my life, when I was just starting to understand what it meant to be the wrong kind of person, it taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. About outsiders. About who gets to be the hero. About what the world does to people it decides don't fit. That lesson came from a black man on a screen in 1968. It landed in a white kid in a cinema in 1982. And it's still, 40-odd years later, doing its work. The truth, when it's told clearly enough, lands on whoever needs it, regardless of who it was aimed at. Right? So let's talk about the film. Night of the Living Dead came out in 1968. 96 minutes, a budget of $114,000. Shot in and around Evans City, Pennsylvania, about 30 miles north of Pittsburgh, in the summer and autumn of 1967. $114,000. Sit with that for a second. The Godfather cost $6 million. Jaws cost $9 million. Halloween, itself a masterclass in doing everything with nothing, cost $300,000. Night of the Living Dead cost $114,000, and it changed horror cinema permanently, influenced every zombie film, TV show, video game, and piece of zombie-adjacent culture made in the 50-odd years since. And now it is preserved in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as a work of cultural, historic, and aesthetic significance. All for $114,000. George Romero was 27 when he made it. Running a small Pittsburgh production company called The Latent Image, industrial films, local TV, and commercials, he and his producing partner, Russell Streiner, decided they wanted to make a feature film. They went around to local businessmen with their hands out. $10,000 here, $5,000 there. People who were curious and had a bit of money to spare liked the idea of being in the film business. Romero and his crew shot on weekends. Cast and crew worked for deferred pay. The special effects were mostly chocolate syrup, latex, and whatever came to hand. By any reasonable metric, this should not be nearly as good as it is. It should be just a regional curiosity, a drive-in program, or something you catch at 3 a.m. and forget by breakfast. Instead, it is a masterpiece, and I don't use the word lightly. The premise is simple. The recently dead are coming back to life and attacking the living. A woman named Barbara, that's Barbara with an A. I mention this only because the opening scene will lodge that spelling in your brain permanently. She and her brother Johnny drive to a rural Pennsylvania cemetery to visit their father's grave. Johnny, being the asshole brother that he is, starts teasing her. "They're coming to get you, Barbara," pointing at some distant, shambling figure as a joke. The figure is no joke. Johnny turns out to be the very first casualty, which is a universe telling you that teasing your sister in a cemetery has consequences. So Barbara runs. She finds a farmhouse, and the poor girl is in full shock, barely functional, moving on instinct. Then Ben arrives. He pulls up in a truck and takes in the situation in about 30 seconds and immediately gets to work. Boarding up windows, barricading doors. He is taking stock and making decisions. Ben is calm. Ben is competent. Ben is in charge. Not because anyone voted on it, not because he asked permission, but because someone needed to be, and he is the person who can. Eventually, more survivors turn up from the cellar. There's Harry and Helen Cooper and their daughter Karen, who's been bitten and is gravely ill, as well as 2 young people, Tom and Judy. Harry Cooper is immediately and comprehensively awful. The kind of man who mistakes volume for authority and stubbornness for principle. He wants everyone in the cellar. Ben wants to barricade the ground floor. They argue. The zombies accumulate outside. And here's what Romero understood that almost nobody else had worked out. The monster in a horror film is almost never the real monster. The zombies are terrifying, genuinely, viscerally, frighteningly, more so in black and white because your imagination fills in what the film leaves out. But they are a force of nature, not malicious. They don't plan. They don't bear grudges. They just come, relentlessly, without rest or reason or negotiation. The real danger in that farmhouse is Harry Cooper. The real danger is always the people inside. Romero was making this film in 1967 and releasing it in 1968, a year that included the assassination of Martin Luther King in April, the assassination of Robert Kennedy in June, and the Democratic National Convention riots in August. The country was eating itself. And here's a horror film where the greatest threat isn't the monsters at the door. It's the frightened, stubborn, wrong-headed man in the cellar who won't listen to the person who actually knows what to do. Romero always said he wasn't trying to make a political film. The social commentary was accidental, he said. Unconscious. He was just making a horror film as well as he could with what he had. The politics got in there on their own, which is usually how the best political art works. Now, the ending. I'm going to talk about the ending because this episode can't be honest without it. Ben survives the night. Of everyone in that farmhouse, the capable ones, the useless ones, good decisions and catastrophically bad ones, Ben is the only one who makes it to the morning. He's in the cellar. The zombies are retreating. A sheriff's posse is moving through the area, mopping them up. Ben hears them, and he comes to a window to take a look. They shoot him. They see a figure in a window, and they shoot him. The film ends with still photographs, newsprint style, grainy, documentary, of the posse pulling Ben's body out with meat hooks and throwing him on a bonfire with the rest of the dead. The film doesn't editorialize, doesn't tell you how to feel, just shows you what happened. A black man survived everything the night could throw at him. Calm when others panicked, right when others were wrong, kept people alive through sheer competence and will. And at dawn, the men with guns looked at him and saw a monster. In 1968, in America. I don't need to draw you a diagram. The posse doesn't always need a reason. Now I want to tell you about the man who played Ben. Because the film is extraordinary, but Duane Jones, the actor, is something else entirely. He deserves more than a footnote in someone else's story. Duane Lionel Jones was born in 1937 and studied at the Sorbonne in Paris. Master's degree from NYU, taught English literature at Long Island University, developed English language training programs for the Peace Corps, helped design Harlem Preparatory School, where he ran the English department, Phelps-Stoke Fund Exchange Scholar in Niger, headed the literature department at Antioch College, executive director of the Black Theater Alliance, artistic director of the Richard Allen Center for Culture and Art in Manhattan. He directed theater, he painted, he wrote, he taught acting at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, and later privately by invitation only to a hand-picked group of students. This is not a man who stumbled into a horror film. This is one of the most comprehensively educated, intellectually serious, multiply talented human beings to ever appear in a low-budget zombie picture. And I mean that as the highest possible compliment to both the man and the picture. Here's how he ended up in it. Originally, the script had been written as a tough guy truck driver. No physical description, no mention of race. Just a man, competent, decisive, someone who took charge. The role had already been cast. An actor named Rudy Ricci was set to play Ben. Jones happened to be in Pittsburgh over Easter weekend of 1967 visiting his family. He knew some of the crew of the film, and he met Romero. And what George Romero saw when he looked at Duane Jones, whatever quality of presence, authority, intelligence, he unmade his casting decision on the spot and remade it. Duane Jones would play Ben. Romero got asked about this a lot. His answer was always the same. Duane Jones was the best actor we met to play Ben. Consciously, I resisted writing new dialogue because he happened to be black. We just shot the script. We just shot the script. I find that both admirable and worth a second look. Admirable because it's true. Romero wasn't trying to make a statement. He was trying to make the best film he could, and casting Jones was the best call available. He made it. That's it. It's worth a second look, though, because whether he intended a statement or not, putting a black man at the center of that story in that year, in that country, was a statement. Intent and impact aren't always the same thing. Sometimes the most radical acts are the ones made without fanfare. Sometimes you change history by doing the obvious thing everyone else was too frightened or too limited to do. He cast the best actor, and he shot the script. Jones himself said, and I want to give you his exact words because they're precise and careful and worth hearing that way. And I quote, It never occurred to me that I was hired because I was black. But it did occur to me that because I was black, it would give a different historic element to the film. He knew. He knew exactly what he was standing in the middle of. He just didn't make it the headline because he was an actor doing a job. His job was to play Ben, and Ben wasn't a symbol. Ben was just a man. That distinction mattered to Jones. Ben's dialogue, as written, was that distinction mattered to Jones. And according to his co-star Carl Hardiman, Ben's dialogue, as written, was that of a lower-class, uneducated person. Duane Jones had studied in Paris, held multiple advanced degrees, was fluent in several languages. The opposite of that character as written in almost every measurable way. He played the character exactly as written, with all the intelligence and presence he actually had. The result is extraordinary. A performance that elevated the material without condescending to it. Ben, as Jones plays him, isn't a truck driver who sounds like a professor. He's just Ben, a man, doing what needs doing. Which is, when you think about it, exactly what a hero is. Jones appeared in 9 films across his entire career. Just 9. Christopher Lee made over 250. Vincent Price made over 100. Duane Jones, who delivered one of the most significant performances in American cinema, did a total of 9 films and spent the rest of his life teaching, directing theater, building institutions, and shaping the next generation of black artists. If you want to know what he could do when the material was worthy of him, find the film Ganja and Hess from 1973. It is one of the strangest, most beautiful horror films ever made, and almost nobody has ever seen it. That's a problem I'd like you to help me correct. He never watched any of Romero's other Dead films. Not Dawn, not Day, none of the other sequels or remakes. He said Night of the Living Dead was his time, his film. He made it, and he didn't need to watch what came after. I find something quietly magnificent about that. He didn't define himself by it, didn't chase it, made it, knew what it was, went back to the real life. There's a story I love. Towards the end of his life, he was teaching at the State University of New York at Old Westbury, head of the theater department. He was with a group of students at a cafe near campus. Ordinary school afternoon, and someone noticed a film on the TV. The students went quiet. Then they started reacting. That low-level collective astonishment you get when people can't believe what they're looking at. Jones turned around. Night of the Living Dead was on the TV. His students had no idea. He had never even mentioned it. He was their professor, Dr. Duane Jones, head of the department, the man who ran their program and shaped their craft. The fact that he'd once been the lead in one of the most important horror films ever made was simply not something he felt the need to share. I think about that moment a lot. The students looking from the screen to the professor and back again. Jones watching himself board up a farmhouse in black and white on a TV out on Long Island. Whatever he felt, recognition, distance, something more complicated, he kept it characteristically to himself. Duane Lionel Jones died on the 22nd of July in 1988 at the age of 51. Cardiopulmonary arrest. The Duane L. Jones Recital Hall at SUNY Old Westbury is named for him. The character Duane Jones in The Walking Dead is named after him. He was only 51, the same age I was not too long ago, and I think about what he'd built by then. The institutions, the students, the productions, the quiet, deliberate life of a man who'd made history on a weekend in Pittsburgh and then gone back to the work he actually cared about. Night of the Living Dead was his time. He was right. It certainly was. And in a cinema in South Carolina in 1982, sitting in the dark with my bag of popcorn and something heavy and unnamed pressing against my chest, I watched this man be calm, competent, and right. And he was the hero, full stop. No asterisk, no qualification. I didn't know his name yet, but I knew what he did to me. Here's the part where we need to talk about Allendale. Not because I want to. I spend a significant portion of my adult life putting considerable geographic and psychological distance between myself and Allendale, South Carolina. And on the whole, I think that was the right call. But this episode doesn't work without it. You can't understand what that film did to me without knowing where I was coming from when I walked into that cinema. So, Allendale. Allendale County, South Carolina. Population when I was growing up there was probably around 10,000 people. Majority black. Significantly majority black, around 70%. It was one of the poorest counties and one of the poorest states in the country. The kind of place that doesn't make the news unless something goes wrong, and things go wrong often enough that it doesn't really make the news even then. South Carolina routinely ranks in the bottom 10 of every meaningful educational metric in the United States. Test scores, graduation rates, per pupil spending, take your pick. Down there near the bottom, keeping company with Mississippi and Alabama and West Virginia. I did not attend the public school system. Here's a brief history of public education in South Carolina. I'm going to give it to you plainly because it's not complicated and dressing it up would be a disservice. Federal courts ordered South Carolina to desegregate its public schools. The process started in 1963 and was mandated comprehensively by 1970. It got to the points where the court said, "You will integrate. This is the law. This is happening." And a substantial portion of the white community said, "Fine, we'll leave." Some families moved to whiter suburbs. Some pulled their kids out entirely. And some, many in Allendale, enrolled their children in a new kind of institution that sprang up across the South in the wake of desegregation, with what I can only describe as remarkable speed and organization. The Private Segregation Academy. Schools built specifically to ensure that white children didn't have to share a classroom with black children. Privately funded, not answerable to any federal mandate, perfectly legal because the Supreme Court had ruled on public schools, not private ones. So across the South, hundreds of these schools opened their doors, white families lined up, and the public schools left behind became chronically underfunded, politically invisible black majority institutions. The damage done to public education in South Carolina in those years is still being counted. And I attended one of those schools, Allendale Academy. 12 years, 1st through 12th grade, one building. Not a campus, a building. For my entire primary and secondary education, graduated from a class of 25. 25. Our mascot was a Confederate soldier, as I said before, and we were known as the Rebels. We flew the Confederate battle flag over our school, and our school song, sung at assemblies, at sporting events, by children taught it was simply tradition, was Dixie. I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. I knew every goddamn word. I'm not going to tell you that my parents were monsters. They weren't. They were ordinary people, products of their own time and place and assumptions. People who loved their children and wanted what they thought was best for them. Operating inside a system that handed them a story about the world and never gave them a serious reason to question it. That's not an excuse. It's a context. There is a difference. And here's the thing that's harder to say than anything else so far. I got a good education. I know how that sounds, but it's true, and leaving it out would be a live omission. And we're past that in this episode. Smaller class sizes, focused teaching, no overcrowding, no underfunding, no classrooms fractured by the political upheaval tearing its way through the rest of the South. Because avoiding that upheaval was precisely what the school had been built to do. While public schools across South Carolina were navigating court orders and community rage and the chaos of a system being forcibly dismantled and rebuilt, Allendale Academy was quiet, orderly, academically solid in a way that many schools around us, starved of resources, simply weren't. I benefited from that, directly, materially, in ways that shaped my life and the person I became. And the stability I benefited from was purchased at a cost I did not pay. The school was left behind, underfunded, under-resourced, serving a community the state had decided wasn't worth full investment. They paid the cost. The children in them paid the cost, and they're still paying for it today. I also want to be accurate. Most white children in Allendale did not attend the academy. It wasn't a community-wide institution, a choice made by some families, enough to fill a school, enough to sustain it for decades, but not all. Many white families kept their children in the public system. The academy was a chapter, an ugly, instructive, telling chapter, but a chapter, not the whole story. 12 years in one building, 25 in my graduating class, strong on academics, thin on everything else. No band, no theater program. For a kid who was already quietly theatrical, already hungry for performance and self-expression, that absence had its own cost. Smaller and personal, but a cost. I got out with a good foundation, a significant blind spot, and a hunger for the larger world that Allendale had never been able to feed. The world I grew up in had a shape, agreed upon, socially reinforced. People who led and people who followed. People whose stories got told and people whose stories were background. Presented not as ideology, not as politics, not as a choice unmade that could be unmade, just the way things were. I absorbed it. Of course I absorbed it. I was a child. Children absorb the world they're given. And alongside everything else I was absorbing, the mascot, the flag, the song, the unspoken curriculum of who mattered and who didn't, I was absorbing something else, something private, something I had no language for and absolutely no safe place to put. The simple fact that I was different in a way that the world I'd been handed was not going to accommodate. I didn't have the words for it. I was a kid in Allendale in the 70s. The vocabulary just wasn't available. What I knew was that something in me didn't fit the shape. And I'd learned very early, very thoroughly, what the world did to things that didn't fit. From the flag, from the song, from the school that existed because someone had decided, very deliberately, that certain people did not belong in the same room. The world is not gentle with its outsiders. I graduated in the spring of 1982, never having sat in a classroom next to a black student. Think about what that means. Not abstractly, but concretely. Allendale County was 70% black. I'd lived there 18 years, and the system I was educated inside had managed, with considerable structural effort, to ensure I reached adulthood having never been required to sit next to one of them and learn something. That's not an accident. That's architecture. I was a good student, and I managed to snag a few scholarships that got me to Columbia. And that autumn, for the first time in my life, I was in classrooms with black students. With students from everywhere, every background, every kind of town, every kind of story. Come to find out, people were just people. I know, astonishing, right? Obvious to anyone who hadn't spent 12 years being carefully insulated from the evidence. And that Halloween, a few weeks into my first semester, I sat in the dark in Russell House and watched a black man be the hero of a horror film. Not a supporting character, not a symbol, not a lesson. The hero. Full stop. The architecture was cracking. It had been cracking for quite a while, actually. The flag, the song, the carefully maintained shape of the world. They'd never quite convinced the part of me that knew, privately, that I just didn't fit. You can't be an outsider, even a hidden one, even a passing one, and fully believe in a system built on excluding outsiders. There's always a fault line, always a place where the story stops adding up. Ben found that fault line and walked straight through it. And I watched him do it, and something that had been quietly loosening in me for years came a little further free. Less than a year after I sat in that cinema, my life changed in a single day. I came out in my sophomore year. I want to sit with that for just a moment because of the context. I came out in my sophomore year at the University of South Carolina, a university whose annual homecoming celebration was called Cockfest. How could I not come out at a university that celebrated something called Cockfest? The universe, as I've mentioned before, is not always subtle. But the way my family found out wasn't a conversation I initiated. It wasn't a coming out in the sense the phrase usually implies. A decision made, a moment chosen, a carefully considered revelation on my own terms. It was none of those things. To put it short, my parents found a letter. A love letter. A love letter from a man named David. And whatever the letter contained, and I'm not going to read it to you, it's mine. It stays mine. It was unambiguous. No innocent interpretations available. No alternative explanation to reach for. My parents read it, and in the space of an afternoon, everything changed. I'd been, until that moment, what I can only describe as the best little boy in the world. Compliant, eager to please, good in school, and careful with other people's feelings. Deeply invested in being the child my family needed me to be. Performing that version of myself for 18 years with considerable dedication and no small amount of genuine love, because I did love my family. Loved them completely, which is precisely what made what came next as devastating as it was. In a single afternoon, I went from being the best little boy in the world to the thing they did not know how to hold. The black sheep. The problem. The one who'd taken everything they'd given him and come back with something they hadn't asked for and did not want. I know that phrase, black sheep. I know its weight, and I've chosen it deliberately because I think it's doing more work than it usually gets credit for. The black sheep is the one who doesn't fit, the one the flock can't accommodate. Defined primarily by what they're not white, not conforming, not the shape the world made for them. I'd spent 18 years watching what happened to people who didn't fit the shape. Now I was one of them. With one difference, one significant, complicated, morally uncomfortable difference I'm going to name plainly. I could pass. Ben couldn't pass. When the posse looked at the window, they saw what they saw, and there was nothing Ben could do about it, and he was dead before anyone asked a question. His outsider status was visible, legible, and permanent. He had no emergency exit. I had one. I'd used it for 18 years. Walked through the world as a straight man, or close enough that nobody looked twice, and the world treated me accordingly, with the ordinary courtesies extended to people who appear to belong. A cost I didn't pay, a shelter I hadn't built, a door open to me because of what I appeared to be rather than what I was. I'm not pretending my experience and Ben's were the same. They weren't. But losing that emergency exit, having it taken from me, suddenly, by a letter someone else read, taught me something about what it cost to be visible when the world would prefer you weren't. My family turned their back on me that summer. Not immediately, not all at once. Families usually aren't that clean about it. There were endless conversations and confrontations and silences that were worse than neither. People who loved me said things I have never forgotten, that I'll carry till I die. Not because I haven't forgiven them. I have, mostly, the way you forgive things that become part of you. But certain words, once spoken, don't unspeak themselves. My mother told me she would rather see me dead. Her baby boy. She'd rather see me dead than see me be what I was. The child she'd raised, the best little boy in the world. She'd rather he didn't exist than exist as is. I don't tell you that to condemn her. She was just a woman of her time and her place, her faith, and a particular story about the world that had never been seriously challenged until her son handed her a challenge she hadn't asked for. I understand it better now than I did then. Understanding it doesn't make it smaller, though, just more complicated, which is the honest way to hold it. There were other things. I was threatened with violence, detained, held against my will by people who loved me and believed they were saving me, in what I can only describe as an attempted conversion, a last-ditch effort to put me back into the shape I'd apparently abandoned. It didn't work. It never works, and it never worked. The only thing it reliably produces is damage. There was damage, and I'm not going to minimize it. I left home that summer, for good. Not dramatically, not with a speech. I just went. I did my best to continue my education, and continue my life, and build the things I was going to build without the people who'd been supposed to help me build it. On the scholarships that kept me in school when nothing else would have. I was alone in a way I hadn't been before, and I haven't been since. The particular aloneness of someone ejected from their own story, handed back by the people who wrote the first chapters. And in that aloneness, something happened that I didn't expect. I started to understand things. Not immediately, not cleanly. Understanding doesn't arrive cleanly, but over the months and years that followed, building a life from the outside in, learning what it meant to be the person the world had decided it didn't want, I started to develop something I hadn't been raised to have. Empathy. Not the performed kind, not the kind you display to show what a good person you are, the real kind. The kind that costs something. The kind that comes from having been on the wrong side of a door and knowing in your body what that feels like. I thought about Ben. More than once in those years. The man who did everything right, calm when others panicked, kept people alive throughout the night, was by any measure the hero of the story, and who was shot at dawn by men who looked at him and saw a monster. I thought about the posse, men with guns and a certainty and a complete absence of curiosity about what they were actually looking at. Men for whom the shape of the world was so fixed and so obvious that a figure in a window could only ever be one thing. They acted on it. It was wrong. Ben was dead. The film ended. I thought about how easy it is to become the posse, how little it requires, how completely the system will support you, validate you, hand you a gun, and point you at the window, and never once ask you to question what you are seeing. I've been raised by the posse. Not cruelly, not with malice, but with love. The love of people who believed the shape of the world was right and were frightened by anything that suggested otherwise. And I'd become, without choosing it, the figure in the window, the thing they would not and could not accommodate. And I recognized him, finally, completely. The hero Ben had always been, competent, clear-eyed, right, and the cost he paid for it. I knew that cost now. I knew it in my bones. Here's what I need to tell you about my parents. They came back. Not quickly, not easily, not without cost to all of us, paid in years and silences and careful, tentative conversations that could have gone wrong at any moment, and sometimes did. Not a clean reconciliation, not a Hallmark movie reconciliation where someone makes a speech and the music swells and everyone goes home changed. Slow, imperfect, human, real. But they came back. My father first, I think, quietly, the way men of his generation handled things they couldn't say directly, through small acts, through showing up, through the gradual, deliberate re-extension of presence into a life they'd withdrawn from. No grand declaration, just there again, choosing to be there again. My mother took longer. What she said, the thing I told you she said, the thing that I'll carry till I die, she never unsaid it. She never apologized. You can't unsay something like that. But she found her way back anyway, which I think in some ways took more courage than saying it in the first place. It's easier sometimes to hold a position than to quietly, privately, without ceremony, let it go. The world changed around them. It does that. It makes the fixed positions of one's decade look like the embarrassments of the next. They watched it change, watched their son build a life, watched that life turn out to be a good one, a real one, a life with love and joy in it, nothing monstrous in it at all. And they did what people do sometimes when the evidence finally outweighs the story they've been telling themselves. They knew better. And when they knew better, they did better. There's a line, and I want to be careful about how I attribute this because the careful attribution is part of the point. A line that's been passed around under Maya Angelou's name for a long enough time that most people take it as settled. The version you usually see goes, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. What actually happened, as best the record shows, is that Angelou said something close to this to Oprah Winfrey. Privately. One woman to another. Oprah carried it, said it publicly, and put it out into the world. The world passed it on, the way wisdom travels when it's true enough to be worth repeating, and somewhere in the repeating, it got written down and attributed and became the thing it is now. I don't say that to diminish it. The way it traveled, mouth to ear, person to person, is the most honest form of transmission for something like this. Some things don't need to be a published source. Some things just need to be true. This one's true. I know it's true because I watched it happen. My parents did what they knew how to do. Products of Allendale, of the South, of a faith and a time and a set of assumptions that had never been seriously stress tested until their son stressed the hell out of them. They did what they knew how to do. It wasn't enough, and it caused damage that doesn't fully repair itself no matter how much time passes. And then, slowly, imperfectly, in the way real people actually change, they knew better. And they did better. I am my parents' son, not as a disclaimer or a softening, as a true thing. I carry Allendale. I carry the academy, the flag, the song, the 12 years in one building, the careful architecture of a world designed to tell me who mattered and who didn't. I carry it the way you carry anything that shaped you before you were old enough to choose your own shape. Not proudly, not with shame exactly. Shame is too simple for something this complicated. With an awareness, with the ongoing responsibility to know what I was given and to do better with it than I was designed to do. You don't get to choose the system you're raised inside. You, however, do get to choose what you do with what it made of you, once you know enough to choose. I learned empathy the hard way. Not from being taught, not from being naturally good, but from needing it and finding it absent. From being the figure in the window. From knowing in my body what it costs to be the wrong kind of person in a world that's decided it knows exactly what kind of person is acceptable. I had the luxury of the emergency exit. I've never forgotten it. Ben didn't have it. Millions of people still don't have it. The least I can do is carry that awareness honestly. But I lost the exit long enough to understand something about what it means to live without one. And that understanding, that particular, costly, irreplaceable education, is the one thing that Allendale Academy, with its small class sizes and its orderly corridors and its Confederate flag, could never have given me. It took David's letter. It took my mother's words. It took a summer of losing everything I thought was solid and building something new from whatever was left. It took, if I'm being completely honest, a black man in a farmhouse, made for nothing, in Pittsburgh in 1968. Ben showed me, before I had the experience to understand what I was seeing, what it looked like to be the outsider who was right, the competent one, the one who deserved to survive, the one the story should have belonged to. And the film showed me what the world actually does with people like that. And the world showed me, personally and specifically, and without too much concern for my feelings on the matter, that the film was not exaggerating. And then, eventually, slowly, imperfectly, in the way real things happen rather than the way we write them in retrospect, the world got a little better. My parents got a little better. I got a little better. The long, grinding, unglamorous work of people choosing over and over to know more than they knew yesterday, that work happened. It's still happening. It'll keep happening as long as there are people willing to do it. When people know better, they do better. Not a guarantee, not a law of nature, not true of everyone or always, or without enormous amounts of time and patience and pain in between, but true enough to pass on, mouth to ear. The way Angelou said it to Oprah, and Oprah said it to the world, and the world carried it forward because it needed carrying. My parents came back. I want to end on that, not on the hard things, the letter, the words, the summer of loss. Those were all true. They stay true. I haven't minimized them, and I won't. But they're not the last word. The last word is, they came back. And when they came back, I let them. I chose to let them back in. That's not a small thing, and I'm not going to pretend it was. Reconciliation isn't weakness. It's the harder choice. I made it, and I'd make it again. They knew better, they did better, and so did I. George Andrew Romero died on the 16th of July in 2017. 77 years. He died in his sleep listening to the score of one of his favorite films, The Quiet Man, John Ford, 1952. His wife held his hand. I find that detail, the John Ford score, the held hand, the sleep, consoling in a way that I can't fully explain. The man who made the most unquiet film I've ever seen went quietly, with music, with someone who loved him. He made 11 feature films, invented wholesale the zombie as the modern world understands it, made films about race, consumerism, journalism, the military-industrial complex, the way institutions fail people they're supposed to protect, all dressed up as horror, all using the freedom genre gives you. The freedom to say true things loudly by pretending to say them about monsters. He changed everything, in black and white, on a shoestring budget, in Pennsylvania, with a cast nobody heard of, one of whom he cast because he was simply the best actor available. We just shot the script. Duane Jones died on the 22nd of July in 1988, at the age of 51. 20 years almost to the day before Romero. His students at Old Westbury didn't know he'd been Ben. He'd never watched the sequels. He said Night of the Living Dead was his time, and he was right. Here's what Duane Jones left behind. Not the performance, though it's extraordinary and permanent and will outlast all of us. What he left behind was a demonstration, a proof of concept. A moment in American cinema where a black man was the hero, not because the script said so, not because the film was making a point about it, not because anyone wrote him a speech about what it meant, but simply because he walked into a room and was the most capable person in it, and the story followed him. He didn't ask permission, didn't explain himself. He just boarded up the windows, took charge, and kept people alive through the night. That's the whole radical act, competence without apology, in a year when that combination, black, male, authoritative, unapologetic, centered, was incendiary. In a country that had just watched Martin Luther King die on a balcony in Memphis. in a film that ends with a posse at dawn and the meat hooks and the bonfire. Romero held that mirror up. Jones stood in front of it without flinching. Between them, they made something that a scared white kid from Allendale, sitting in a cinema in Columbia 14 years later, needed to see. Not because it was made for him, it wasn't. But the truth, when it's told clearly enough, lands on whoever needs it, regardless of who it was aimed at. That's what the best horror does. Not just frighten you. Well, yeah, of course frighten you, but the film is genuinely terrifying, and I will not have it described otherwise. But underneath the terror, behind the boarded windows and the relentless dead and the arguments in the cellar and the awful, inevitable dawn, the best horror tells you the truth about the world. About who gets to be a hero and who gets shot at sunrise. About who the monsters really are. About the people inside the house who are more dangerous than anything outside of it. About the systems we build and the stories we tell ourselves about why they're natural and right and simply the way things are. Night of the Living Dead told me that truth in 1982. I wasn't ready for all of it at the time. I absorbed what I could and filed the rest somewhere I could find it later. And I've been opening it ever since. I grew up in Allendale, South Carolina. I ended up in Wales, married to a man named Billy, in possession of 2 cats, Goose, who is a magnificent orange disaster, and Lily, who is beautiful and knows it and would very much like you to know that she knows it. Making podcasts about horror films in a spare room in Cardiff. Talking to strangers about the things that frightened me and the things that shaped me, and the complicated, winding, occasionally absurd road that connects the two. Not bad for a kid from Allendale. Not bad for the black sheep. Night of the Living Dead, the original, is available to watch for free legally online. It entered the public domain due to a copyright registration error, which is the most appropriately chaotic footnote to the most chaotic film in horror history. Watch it. If you've seen it, watch it again. Watch it knowing what you know about Duane Jones. Watch the way he holds himself. Watch the way he makes decisions. Watch the way the film treats him, not as a symbol, not as a statement, just as a man who is better at surviving than everyone else in the building. And then watch the ending. Don't look away. The ending is the point. Episode 6 is called The Exorcist. The summer I hit puberty and puberty hit back. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions on that one. It involves William Friedkin. It involves 1973. And it involves a level of personal mortification that will make everything I've told you today look like light conversation. If this episode meant something to you, if something in it landed or shifted something, or sent you back to a film or a memory or a conversation you needed to have, I'd love to hear about it. You can find me at Baz to the Bonecast on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky. On X, I'm Baz to the Bone Pod. Everything else, show notes, references, full list of films, is at beaconsai/Baz to the Bonecast. If you're on Apple Podcast or Spotify, please know that a review takes 2 minutes and it does more for this show than almost anything else you can do. If you've already left one, thank you. It matters more than I know how to say it without getting embarrassing about it. Until next time, I'm Baz Bishop. Now you tell me something.